Bible Codex, Ancient Discoveries, Modern Revelations.
You won't believe what archaeologists discovered in the Judean Desert in 2024. And honestly, when I first heard about this, my hands started trembling because this changes everything we thought we knew about biblical wealth and God's divine plan for trade. Picture this: a team of researchers working near Qumran, where those famous Dead Sea Scrolls were found decades ago, suddenly uncovers something that looks like a small pyramid structure buried in the ancient sands. But here's the incredible part. This wasn't just any ordinary archaeological find. This pyramid connects directly to one of the most mysterious documents ever discovered, the Copper Scroll, and together they're revealing trade secrets that could transform how we understand biblical prophecy in 2025 and beyond. Let me take you back to 1952, when archaeologists first discovered the Copper Scroll in Cave 3 at Qumran. Unlike every other Dead Sea Scroll written on parchment or papyrus, this one was etched into copper, and when they finally unrolled it years later, what they found inside made scholars' jaws drop. This wasn't religious poetry or biblical commentary like the other scrolls. Instead, it read like an ancient treasure map, listing locations where enormous amounts of gold, silver, and precious goods were hidden throughout the Judean wilderness. Dr. Leah Abram, one of the leading scholars studying these ancient documents, describes it perfectly when she says, "The Copper Scroll is essentially a biblical blueprint for wealth, written by people who knew exactly where divine treasures were stored." Now imagine if your great-grandfather had buried treasure in your backyard and left you a detailed map, but you couldn't quite figure out where X marked the spot. That's exactly what researchers have been dealing with for over 70 years. With this Copper Scroll, the locations it describes have been cryptic, using ancient Hebrew terms and geographical markers that seemed to point everywhere and nowhere at once. But everything changed when that pyramid structure emerged from the desert floor in 2024, because suddenly those cryptic clues started making perfect sense. You see, the Copper Scroll mentions hiding places near the dry river and beneath the stepped stones, descriptions that seemed impossible to locate, until archaeologists realized they were looking at the pyramid site. When they compared the scroll's ancient Hebrew text with the geographical features around this newly discovered structure, the pieces fit together like a divine puzzle that had been waiting thousands of years for the right moment to be solved. This discovery represents more than just archaeological excitement. It's a window into how God's people in biblical times understood divine provision and economic blessing. Here is where this gets really fascinating for us living in 2025. According to 2 Chronicles 9:1, we read about Solomon's incredible wealth and how the weight of gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents of gold, which in today's money would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But Solomon's wealth wasn't just about personal luxury. It was about demonstrating God's covenant blessings and establishing trade relationships that would spread knowledge of the true God throughout the known world. The Copper Scroll and this pyramid discovery suggest that these trade networks and their wealth storage systems were far more sophisticated and spiritually significant than we ever imagined. Consider this reality. We're living in 2025, a time when many believers sense something significant stirring in the spiritual realm, and suddenly we're uncovering physical evidence that validates the biblical accounts of divine wealth and God's economic plans. This isn't coincidental timing, it's prophetic timing. The pyramid's emergence from the Judean Desert, after being hidden for potentially 2,000 years, feels like God is preparing to reveal something important about His provision and blessing our current season. Whether you're part of the Black church tradition, with its rich history of trusting God through economic hardship, or you come from white evangelical backgrounds emphasizing biblical prophecy, this discovery speaks to the universal hope that God has not forgotten His promises of provision. The copper scroll itself reads like an ancient inventory list, but when you understand the Hebrew terms being used, it becomes clear that this wasn't just about storing wealth for safekeeping. The scroll mentions gold that is refined, silver that is pure, and aromatic substances from distant lands, all terms that connect directly to the trade goods that flowed through biblical Israel during its most prosperous periods. These weren't random treasures but carefully catalogued trade, goods that represented the economic lifeline of an entire civilization. Dr. Ezra Cohen, whose research focuses on ancient Middle Eastern commerce, explains that this scroll essentially maps biblical commerce in a way that proves the sophisticated trade networks described throughout Scripture. When you read 1 Kings 10:14-15, you discover that the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, besides that from the explorers, and from the business of the merchants, and from all the kings of Arabia, and the governors of the country. This passage reveals that Solomon's wealth came through established trade relationships and commercial networks, not just miraculous provision. The copper scroll appears to document exactly these kinds of trade activities, showing us that God's people understood commerce as a vehicle for both blessing and witness. What makes this pyramid discovery even more remarkable is its location near Cuman, where the Essene community lived and worked for several centuries before and during the time of Christ. These weren't just religious hermits hiding in the desert. Recent archaeological evidence shows they were actively involved in trade and commerce throughout the region. The Essenes were the guardians of biblical manuscripts, and apparently also the guardians of biblical trade secrets. They understood that preserving God's word included preserving knowledge about how God provides materially for his people. This connects beautifully to both Black spiritual traditions that sing about God's provision through trials, and white hymn traditions that celebrate divine blessing and abundance. When we sing How Great Thou Art or Blessed Assurance, we're echoing the same faith that motivated ancient believers to carefully document and preserve knowledge about God's economic blessings. The pyramid and the copper scroll represent a physical manifestation of that faith, proof that our spiritual ancestors took God's promises of provision seriously enough to create permanent records and storage systems. Now let's talk about what they actually found in this pyramid, because the artifacts are absolutely mind-blowing. When the archaeological team carefully excavated the stepped chambers within the structure, they discovered amphorae, those large ceramic jars used in ancient times, still containing traces of precious resins and aromatic oils. These match exactly the types of goods mentioned in the copper scroll's inventory. They also found silver ingots, marked with symbols that correspond to the Hebrew text on the scroll, creating an undeniable connection between the two discoveries. Dr. Miriam Stein, who led the excavation team, describes the pyramid as essentially a biblical Fort Knox, designed to protect and preserve the most valuable trade goods of its era. The structure itself shows sophisticated understanding of preservation techniques, with internal chambers designed to protect contents from moisture and temperature fluctuations. This wasn't primitive storage. This was advanced commercial infrastructure that allowed biblical Israel to compete with the great trading empires of the ancient world. The silver ingots they discovered align perfectly with 2 Kings 12:13, which describes how the money that was brought into the house of the Lord was used for various purposes, including trade and temple maintenance. Which describes how the money that was brought into the house of the Lord was used for various purposes, including trade and temple maintenance. These archaeological finds prove that the biblical accounts of systematic wealth management and trade operations were historically accurate, not just spiritual metaphors. God's people really did develop sophisticated systems for handling the material blessings that flowed from their covenant relationship with the Almighty. Here's what's absolutely incredible about the timing of this discovery. The pyramid structure was revealed in 2024, just as we're entering what many prophecy scholars believe could be a significant prophetic season in 2025. and 2026. The fact that these trade secrets are being uncovered now, when the global economy is experiencing unprecedented challenges and changes, feels like divine timing. God might be reminding his people that he has always had economic plans and provision strategies that transcend human understanding. When you study Zechariah 9:3, you read that Tyre built herself a stronghold and heaped up silver like dust and gold like the dirt of the streets. This prophecy speaks about the wealth of nations, but it also implies that there are divine principles governing how wealth flows and where it's stored. The pyramid discovery suggests that God's people in biblical times understood these principles and created physical systems to work within God's economic designs. This isn't about prosperity theology or health and wealth preaching. This is about recognizing that God has always cared about the material needs of his people and provided practical wisdom for meeting those needs. The Copper Scroll's cryptic directions have been puzzling researchers for decades, but the pyramid location makes many of them suddenly clear. Phrases like "in the cave that faces east" and "under the stepped stones," where the water once flowed, now point to specific geographic features around the pyramid site. It's like God preserved this treasure map for exactly the right moment in history, when we would have the technology and spiritual maturity to understand what it means. Recent excavations in 2024 around the broader Qumran area have revealed extensive trade depot facilities that confirm the region was a major commercial hub, not just a religious retreat. These findings include pottery with markings indicating goods from as far away as India and Ethiopia, proving that biblical Israel's trade networks reached across the known world. Dr. Amos Levy, whose team uncovered these trade depots, says, Qumran was functioning as a sophisticated trade hub, with the Essene community managing commercial activities alongside their religious duties. This makes perfect sense when you consider that the Essenes were expecting the Messiah and wanted to preserve everything important for his kingdom, including knowledge about godly commerce and trade. They understood that when God's kingdom was fully established, there would still be need for economic systems and trade relationships, so they preserved both spiritual manuscripts and commercial wisdom for future generations. The evidence of desert caravan routes discovered in 2023 near Ain Gedi shows incense residues that match exactly the aromatics mentioned in the Copper Scroll. These weren't just luxury items. Incense and spices were essential trade goods that connected Israel to international markets and allowed God's people to participate in the global economy of their time. When you read 1 Kings 10:10 about the Queen of Sheba bringing spices and very much gold and precious stones, you're seeing documentation of these same trade networks that the Copper Scroll was designed to preserve and protect. What's fascinating for American believers in 2025 is how these discoveries unite us across ethnic and cultural lines around shared biblical heritage. Whether your ancestors sang spirituals about trusting God's provision during slavery or hymns about divine blessing during westward expansion, these archaeological finds confirm that God's economic principles transcend human cultural boundaries. The pyramid and the Copper Scroll represent universal biblical truths about divine provision that speak to every believer regardless of background. The prophetic implications of these discoveries become even more significant when you consider the timing. As we move through 2025 and toward 2026, many biblical scholars are noting unusual convergences of prophetic markers and global events. The emergence of these ancient trade secrets feels like God is preparing his people for an economic season that will require both spiritual discernment and practical wisdom about how divine provision works in the real world. According to Revelation 18:12-13, end times prophecy specifically mentions trade goods including gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble, and cinnamon and incense. fragrant oil and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and bodies and souls of men. Notice how many of these items match exactly what's documented in the Copper Scroll and found in the pyramid excavation. This isn't about setting dates for the return of Christ or predicting specific economic events. Rather, it's about recognizing that God has always been preparing His people for every season, including seasons that require understanding how spiritual principles apply to material provision. The pyramid discovery suggests that our biblical ancestors were far more sophisticated in their understanding of divine economics than we've given them credit for. Dr. Nami Green, whose theological research focuses on biblical economics, explains that God's trade systems weren't just about moving goods. They were about demonstrating covenant faithfulness through material provision. When Solomon's ships brought back gold from Ophir, or when Abraham's wealth increased through his relationship with God, these weren't isolated incidents, but examples of divine economic principles that remain consistent throughout history. The king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Huram. Once every 3 years the merchant ships came, bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and money. This describes systematic, ongoing trade operations that generated wealth through consistent application of wise commercial principles. The Copper Scroll appears to document exactly these kinds of systematic approaches to managing trade wealth, suggesting that God's people developed institutional knowledge about divine provision that they wanted to preserve for future generations. Here's what's particularly encouraging about these discoveries for believers living in 2025. The pyramid and Copper Scroll prove that God's promises about provision aren't just spiritual metaphors, but practical realities that can be documented, studied, and applied. I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places. We're seeing physical evidence that God really does have hidden systems of provision that He reveals to His people at the right times. The Qumran community's role as both spiritual guardians and trade facilitators shows us that there's no separation between sacred and secular. When it comes to God's kingdom economics, they preserved manuscripts about worship and also preserved knowledge about commerce because they understood that both are essential for living out covenant relationship with God. This should encourage Black believers whose church traditions have always emphasized God's provision through struggle, and white believers whose traditions emphasize biblical stewardship and wise financial management, which promises that wealth and riches shall be in His house. We can see that this isn't just about individual prosperity, but about understanding how God's people throughout history have participated in His economic plans. The pyramid discovery suggests that these plans include both miraculous provision and practical wisdom about how to manage and preserve the resources God provides. The year 2025 feels particularly significant because it represents a moment when archaeological evidence is converging with prophetic anticipation and global economic uncertainty. The Copper Scroll's treasures aren't just ancient history. They're a reminder that God has always had provision strategies that transcend human economic systems. When banks fail or markets crash or governments struggle with debt, God's people can remember that our covenant relationship includes access to divine wisdom about material provision that has been tested and proven over thousands of years. Dr. Samuel Weiss, whose research focuses on biblical prophecy and modern applications, suggests that America in 2025 has a unique opportunity to rediscover biblical wealth principles through archaeological evidence, like the Copper Scroll discovery. This isn't about American exceptionalism, but about recognizing that believers in every nation have access to the same divine economic principles that sustained God's people throughout biblical history. The Copper Scroll's detailed inventory system shows us that biblical wealth management involved careful record keeping, strategic storage, and systematic approaches to preserving resources for future needs. These principles apply just as much to modern believers as they did to ancient Israelites. Whether you're managing a household budget, or running a business, or planning for retirement, the wisdom preserved in documents like the Copper Scroll provides time-tested guidance for handling material resources in ways that honor God. When Revelation 3:18 advises, "Buy from me gold refined in the fire," it's using commercial language to describe spiritual realities. But the commercial metaphor works because God's people have always understood that spiritual and material provision operate according to consistent divine principles. The pyramid discovery provides physical evidence of how these principles were applied in practical settings by people who took both spiritual and material stewardship seriously. What makes this particularly relevant for 2025 and 2026 is that we're living in a time when traditional economic assumptions are being challenged by technological changes, political uncertainties, and global instabilities. The Copper Scroll's trade secrets remind us that God's people have navigated economic uncertainty before, and that divine provision often comes through understanding and applying biblical principles, rather than just hoping for miraculous intervention. The connection between America's economic power and biblical trade principles becomes especially significant when you consider how many of our nation's founding economic ideas were rooted in biblical concepts of stewardship, fair trade, and divine blessing through hard work and wise management. The pyramid discovery provides archaeological validation for economic principles that have shaped Western civilization for centuries, reminding us that biblical wisdom about commerce and trade isn't outdated but eternally relevant. Think about how the Copper Scroll's preservation system worked. The Essenes knew that they were living through turbulent times, with political upheaval and military conflicts threatening their community's survival. Instead of just hoping their knowledge would somehow survive, they took practical steps to preserve both spiritual and material wisdom for future generations. They wrote important information on materials that would last, hid it in secure locations, and created backup systems to ensure their most valuable knowledge wouldn't be lost. This same practical approach to preservation shows up in how they managed the pyramid storage facility. The structure wasn't just a random hiding place, but a carefully engineered system designed to protect valuable trade goods through uncertain times. The chambers were constructed to maintain stable temperatures and humidity levels. The entrance was concealed to prevent looting, and the location was chosen to be accessible to authorized personnel while remaining hidden from enemies. These archaeological findings should inspire modern believers to think practically about how we preserve and pass on both spiritual and material wisdom to future generations. The Essenes understood that loving their neighbors included making sure valuable knowledge about God's provision wouldn't die with their generation. They were stewards of divine revelation in every sense, including revelation about how God's economic principles work in real-world applications. As we celebrate these discoveries in 2025, it's important to recognize how they unite believers across racial and cultural lines around shared biblical heritage. The psalm that says how good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity takes on new meaning when we see physical evidence that our spiritual ancestors preserved wisdom for believers regardless of their ethnic background or cultural context. Black spirituals that sing about God's provision during times of oppression, and white hymns that celebrate divine blessing during times of prosperity are both validated by these archaeological discoveries. The pyramid and Copper Scroll prove that God's economic principles work in every situation, whether people are experiencing persecution or prosperity, whether they're in positions of power or struggling for basic survival. The universal nature of biblical trade principles means that believers from every background can learn from the Copper Scroll's wisdom about divine provision. When the scroll documents systematic approaches to preserving wealth through uncertain times, it's speaking to modern believers who are concerned about economic instability. when it shows how God's people participated in international trade networks while maintaining their spiritual distinctiveness. It's providing guidance for believers who want to engage with global economics without compromising their faith. Here's what's particularly encouraging about these discoveries. As we move through 2025, the Copper Scroll and Pyramid aren't just museum pieces that tell us about the past. They're prophetic signs that remind us about God's unchanging character and His consistent commitment to providing for His people. The same God who inspired ancient believers to create sophisticated preservation systems for His trade wisdom is still inspiring modern believers to discover and apply His economic principles today. The timing of these archaeological revelations feels like God is preparing His people for a season when biblical economic wisdom will be especially important. As traditional financial systems face unprecedented challenges and technological changes reshape how commerce works, believers need both spiritual discernment and practical knowledge about how divine provision operates in changing circumstances. Dr. Rachel Martinez, whose research focuses on biblical archaeology and modern applications, observed, "The Copper Scroll discovery represents a convergence of ancient wisdom and contemporary need that suggests God is providing His people with tools for navigating economic uncertainty." The year 2025 also marks a significant moment for American believers because it represents a time when archaeological evidence is validating biblical accounts. Just as cultural pressures challenge the reliability of Scripture, the physical proof provided by discoveries like the Pyramid and Copper Scroll strengthens faith by showing that biblical narratives about divine provision and sophisticated ancient civilizations are historically accurate, not just religious mythology. This archaeological validation becomes especially important for younger believers who are growing up in educational environments that often dismiss biblical accounts as primitive or unreliable. When they can see physical evidence that proves biblical peoples had advanced knowledge about commerce, trade, and wealth management, it strengthens their confidence in Scripture's overall reliability and relevance. The Copper Scroll's detailed descriptions of trade goods and their storage locations also provide insight into how biblical peoples understood the relationship between spiritual faithfulness and material blessing. These weren't people who believed that godliness guaranteed automatic wealth, but they were people who understood that covenant relationship with God includes access to divine wisdom about managing material resources responsibly. When you study the specific trade goods mentioned in the Copper Scroll, you discover items that were essential for both religious worship and daily commerce. Incense and spices were needed for temple services, but also for international trade. Gold and silver served as both offerings to God and currency for business transactions. This integration of spiritual and material purposes shows a mature understanding of how divine provision works through practical channels, rather than just miraculous intervention. The pyramid's sophisticated preservation systems demonstrate that biblical peoples took long-term planning seriously and understood that being good stewards of God's gifts requires practical wisdom about protecting and preserving resources for future needs. This should encourage modern believers to think beyond immediate consumption and consider how their financial decisions impact their ability to serve God's purposes over time. As we approach 2026, many biblical scholars are noting convergences between prophetic timelines and current global events that suggest we may be entering a particularly significant season in God's plan for His people. The discovery of ancient trade secrets during this time frame feels like God is reminding His people that He has always had economic strategies that transcend human understanding, and that these strategies become especially important during times of global transition. The Copper Scroll's preservation for nearly 2,000 years shows God's faithfulness in keeping His promises about revelation and provision across generations and cultures. The same God who made sure this ancient wisdom survived Roman occupation Byzantine rule, Ottoman control, and modern political conflicts, is still faithful to provide his people with everything they need to thrive in whatever circumstances they face. What makes these discoveries particularly relevant for American believers is how they demonstrate that biblical economic principles are scalable from individual households to entire nations. The same stewardship principles that helped ancient Israelites manage their personal resources also enabled their nation to become a major player in international trade during Solomon's reign. These principles can work just as effectively for modern believers, whether they're managing family budgets or building businesses, or influencing national economic policies. The archaeological evidence from the pyramid site shows that biblical peoples understood diversification, preservation, record-keeping, and strategic planning in ways that rival modern financial management techniques. They weren't just hoping God would magically meet their needs. They were applying divine wisdom through practical systems that honored God, while producing sustainable provision for their communities. This should inspire confidence among believers who sometimes feel guilty about planning ahead or managing money strategically. The Copper Scroll and pyramid discoveries prove that practical wisdom about material resources isn't unspiritual, but actually demonstrates faith in God's desire to provide for people through their wise application of His principles. As you think about your own life in 2025 and beyond, these archaeological discoveries remind you that you're part of a long tradition of believers who have faced economic uncertainty with faith in God's provision combined with practical wisdom about how divine blessing works in real-world situations. The same God who gave ancient believers wisdom to create the Copperol's preservation systems is available to give you wisdom for managing whatever financial challenges or opportunities you're currently facing. The unity that these discoveries create among diverse believers reflects the unity that God intends for His people around His promises of provision. Whether your family background includes stories of trusting God through poverty or testimonies of God's blessing through prosperity, the archaeological evidence confirms that divine provision is available to every believer who learns to apply biblical principles with faith and wisdom. The pyramid and copper scroll represent physical proof that God's promises about caring for His people aren't just spiritual metaphors, but practical realities that can be documented, studied, and applied by believers in every generation and culture. As we move through 2025 and toward 2026, these discoveries encourage us to embrace both the spiritual and practical dimensions of divine provision with confidence that God is still revealing His wisdom to those who seek with sincere hearts. Your role in this season isn't just to admire these archaeological discoveries, but to study what they teach us about applying biblical economic principles in contemporary situations. The Copper Scroll's trade secrets weren't meant to stay hidden forever. They were preserved so that believers in every generation could learn from the wisdom of their spiritual ancestors about how God provides for His people through practical application of divine principles. As you share this incredible discovery with others, remember that you're not just spreading interesting information, but participating in God's plan to strengthen His people's faith through archaeological evidence that validates biblical truth. The pyramid and copper scroll discoveries represent a gift to the global church that transcends denominational and cultural boundaries, proving that God's provision is available to every believer who learns to trust His wisdom and apply His principles with faithful diligence. Embrace these revelations as confirmation that God has always had plans for providing for His people that include both miraculous intervention and practical wisdom about managing material resources. The archaeological evidence emerging in 2025 reminds us that we serve a God who cares about every aspect of our lives, including our need for material provision, and who has given us both spiritual promises and practical guidance for experiencing His blessing in every season of life.